Lab 11. So we are continuing now with the nervous system, but this week we talked about the spinal nerves, sensations, and reflexes. And the thing that makes reflexes in particular somewhat unique is because they really don't have to a lot of times communicate with the brain. So we always think about the brain as being, the thing that controls everything that happens in our body, but there are, of course, some things that happen without the brain even needing to be involved. And these are oftentimes things that, are having to do with the basics for keeping us alive. So eating, breathing. And today, if we talk about reflexes, we can think about, protecting our body against harm, like bodily harm, such as if you step on a nail, your foot is automatically going to come up off the ground away from that nail so you don't put the nail through your foot, right? And so we have a couple of reflexes that we can talk about today. One of them I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with. So this patellar reflex. So I'm sure that as you grew up, you went in for your annual physical and the doctor brought out their little hammer and maybe you thought that it was funny, maybe it kind of freaked you out a little bit, but your doctor just gave you a fairly hard tap on the knee. Shouldn't hurt, but it should cause this patellar reflex. And so they're going to test that to make sure that basically your nervous system is functioning as it should. But let's look today at a little bit of the mechanics of what is happening here. So your book has this focus figure 13.1 that kind of lays out the patellar reflex, which is a good example because it's a very easy one for us to understand because we've all had this reaction stimulated in us before. And so we did this in lab last week if you were not there, but you at least have had it done at the doctor's office, right? So the important thing to remember is that for all of these reflexes, you have to have muscle spindles. So anything that is causing a muscle to react to a stimulus, such as you having your patellar tendon tapped or something similar of the sort, is going to stimulate these muscle spindles, which is this little guy right here. So these are very particular parts of the muscle, and they are going to basically have this sensory neuron kind of wrapped around them. And so that sensory neuron can detect any changes in that muscle spindle if it gets stretched or pulled on a little bit. So as our patellar tendon is tapped, so our patellar tendon would be like down here at the end of our quadriceps, so that group of muscle group, the quadriceps muscle group, our patellar tendon would be hit, but this is all connected, right? So our tendons are just what attach our muscles to bone. So if we tap the patellar tendon, it is going to pull on this entire muscle group. So pulling on that muscle group is going to activate this muscle spindle. That muscle spindle is going to send its signal back to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord, without even needing to communicate with the brain, is going to recognize that signal, and it is immediately going to turn around and say, okay, we're being stretched, so we should probably have this reaction where we cause the leg to kick out. So the reason for the patellar reflex is probably to prevent harm, right? Because that's what a lot of these things are, is to prevent bodily harm. So if you think about if you stub your toe or if you hit your elbow, or in this case, if your patellar tendon is hit with a hammer, it is being stretched really, really, really quickly. So there's a pretty big impact causing that to happen. And so anything that is a hard impact in a brief period of time could be causing damage to your body. And so this is your body's way to protect against it. And so whatever is hitting you, it's going to basically tell your leg to kick and get that thing away from your body. So you can kind of think about that happening. And so the sensory neuron sends the signal back to the spinal cord. That spinal cord is going to cause a muscle group to contract, which is going to be the quadriceps muscle. But at the same time, there is always another muscle that is going to be told to relax when we're talking about a limb. So your Achilles reflex, like the Achilles tendon on the back of your foot, is a very, very similar one. So these are all going to have this muscle contracting and then a muscle relaxing. Now, why, if we look at this on the leg, why would we want the quadriceps to contract and also have the hamstrings muscle group relaxing at the same time? Why do you need this relaxation part of it? Why isn't the contraction of this muscle enough? So think about that for just a second and see if you can answer that on your own. Okay, if you're stumped, really, this is just going to be so that your leg is not kind of working against itself. So we want this muscle to contract because that is going to pull your leg up, right? That's what's causing this upward swing of your foot to kick. But if this one is also contracting, you would basically just be like clenching. If you imagine your elbow is a very similar one. If both of the muscles on my forearm were contracting, it would just be like clenching my arm, whereas you want to actually stimulate this kick movement. So let's look at this on your worksheet for just a second, and we can go over a couple more details there, but I would recommend coming back to this diagram in your book, because this will be really helpful for reminding you what all of these things do. Okay, let's take a look at this on your worksheet now and focus on just kind of the very basics of how this reaction works in any scenario, not just your patellar reflex, but anytime we have a stimulus on the surface of our skin or on a muscle that causes, a twitch or, pulling our hand away from a hot surface or from a nail in this picture down here, or, your patellar tendon being stretched and causing your leg to kick. These are going to be simple reflex reactions. They require no thought on your part. And so the reason for that is because they have this really simple way of communicating that doesn't even require the central nervous system. So anytime we have nerves that are outside of the brain and spinal cord, such as both of these right here, so this red one and this blue one, those are going to be called peripheral nerves. And these two peripheral nerves in this image are going to simply communicate with each other to detect that stimulus of the sharp nail, and then sending a message back to the muscle to say, hey, pull your hand away really fast because you might hurt yourself if you continue to push down onto that nail, right? And so that's why so quickly when you feel something sharp, like, I don't know, when you step on a Lego in your house and you immediately react by pulling your foot away without even thinking about it. And then, later on you detect that it's actually a painful stimulus. It's because of this kind of cutting out the middleman and not even requiring your brain to be aware of the situation before you start to react to it. So let's look at a few of these details. It's going to be very similar to what we just looked at for the patellar reflex. We're just going to go hit a few of these so you kind of understand what you're looking at here. And so we have 3 neurons that are involved in this process. So hopefully you can kind of picture 2 of them that we just talked about for the patellar reflex. So we have, first of all, the sensory neuron, right? So detecting that nail in the skin. What's going to be the blue one down at the bottom? That's going to be the motor neuron, right? So that is what is causing our muscle to move away from that painful stimulus. But we also have this green one in the middle of this image. So what is this final neuron going to be called? Well, this is an interneuron. And I remember that as being like an integration neuron. So we don't need the brain to be involved in this initial, knee-jerk reaction, pulling away from this nail. But that signal is still going to be passed along to the brain to tell our brain what we stepped on and why we reacted the way in which we did. So the interneuron is there to kind of receive the signal at the same time and eventually pass it along up the spinal cord and to the brain. But this is not even going to exist in every reflex arc. It's just there to pass along the signal if it's necessary. In simple, muscle stretch reactions like the patellar reflex, you might not even have interneurons in all of these cases. Really what we need to cause the reaction is just the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. But take a couple minutes, try to look on page 519 of your book and in focus figure 13.1, see if you can fill out the rest of this diagram, and then I'll fill out the rest here, but pause the video, see if you can do it on your own, and then I'll talk about just a couple of these things really briefly. Okay, hopefully you took a second to fill this out yourself, but there's always 2 sides to this reflex arc, the pathway going up to your spinal cord and then the pathway coming back down to create that simple arc of this reaction. So the interneuron, remember, is there, but it's not super necessary. So I like to focus on kind of the rest of these things. We always have a receptor at the skin. So the receptor is going to be what detects that stimulus up here. And then we also always have an effector, which is the muscle being moved to pull your foot away from that harmful nail. And if we look at the rest of these pathways, it just kind of, branches of where we're going from the receptor and where we're going to the effector. So the receptor detects it, sends that signal along the sensory neuron. That sensory neuron Its cell bodies actually lie in the dorsal root ganglion, which is why that dorsal root ganglion exists. So that little bulge that you see in the dorsal root of your spinal column, which we saw on the model, is because your sensory neurons have their cell bodies there. And that's because these sensory neurons, their signal only has to go one direction, just from the receptor to the spinal cord. So they can just kind of be external from the spinal cord because they're really just a pathway to send that signal along. Whereas the motor neuron has to be two-sided with its dendrites and its axons at the other end so it can pick up the message and then pass it along and actually transmit that signal to the actual muscle in our body. And so that's a bipolar neuron, whereas the sensory neurons are only unipolar. The effector, the motor neuron going to the effector comes out of the ventral root, which since that neuron is bipolar, it does not have its cell bodies outside of the spinal cord. So they're just going to be found within the spinal cord. And when you go down to the bottom and you get this all filled out, try to give me a little bit of information on the 5 steps of the reflex arc. So I'll go over the first one really quick. The first step of the reflex arc, you can tell me, where it occurs. So it is going to occur at the receptor. And what is the receptor going to do? Well, it is simply the site of the stimulus. So it's gathering information from our external environment to pass it along to our body, which of course, we have to be able to communicate with the external environment. So these receptors are extremely important because they allow us to detect everything around us and be able to, be a whole person that can communicate with the outside world. So go through, fill out those 5 steps of the reflex arc and try to give me just a couple of words of where they occur, first of all, and then what they're actually doing, what their action is. Okay, Luna, let's test your reflexes. Come here. Let's test your reflexes. Come here. Should we test your reflexes? Should we test your reflexes? Okay, Luna, let's test your reflexes. Are they working? That's a good girl. Luna's reflexes work. How about yours?